Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, and drag you out, grab your family, and hold you all at gunpoint, and then they realize that they actually hit the wrong home. Now imagine the government's response is not an apology to you. Instead, they argue that they had discretion to do this and that they cannot be held accountable. This exact scenario already went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, where the family won a 9-0 unanimous ruling against the FBI. But now there are more developments as this case was sent back down to the circuit court after that Supreme Court ruling. A federal appeals court has just issued a brand new ruling involving government immunity, and the family here is telling the 11th Circuit that this new ruling further proves why the FBI should not escape accountability for raiding the wrong home. But despite that Supreme Court unanimous ruling and this new precedent from a different circuit court, the government's response is still that they cannot be held accountable. So let's break down what is now happening in this critical case. Now, before we break down what the Supreme Court said in this ruling and what is now happening with a new ruling dealing with this similar issue, if you like this type of content and you want to make sure that you get it going forward, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Also hit the notification icon to ensure you never miss these videos when I release them. Now, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of a family called the Martins, who were victims of an FBI wrong house raid. Essentially, back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid against a suburban Atlanta area. They were looking for a specific house where some gang members were believed to be, and so they had a warrant to raid that home. Now, instead of going directly to the address on the warrant, one of the officers decided to put the address into what he claims is his personal GPS device, which was his phone. Now, he claims that the GPS routed them to a completely different address, a different home, where at the time Katrina Martin lived with her boyfriend and their 7-year-old son. Now, when the FBI agents arrived at the home, they did not double check to make sure it was the correct address. They claimed at the time that there was no address on the home itself. They didn't double check the mailbox. Instead, they believed that the GPS took them to the right house. So then they smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades inside the home, and pulled out Katrina Martin and her boyfriend, who at the time when they entered the house were hiding in the closet with a shotgun. The FBI pointed guns at the family, pulled out Katrina half naked, also pulled out the 7-year-old son, and they detained them, arrested them, and then began to search the home. Now, while performing that search of the home, one of the agents noticed that there was some mail on a coffee table, and when looking at the mail, he noticed that the address was different from the address they were supposed to be at. That's when they kind of realized that they hit the wrong house and had that huge oh crap moment, we raided the wrong home. The officers then left the home, told Katrina and her family that they would be back soon to explain, and then the officers went about 3 homes down, which was actually separated by a cross street, and then they went and executed that warrant against the correct address. Now, in response to this wrong house raid, the family then sued the government. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The government claimed immunity under the discretionary function exception and asserted that the case must be thrown out because the family could not sue them. Now, on review, the lower court originally sided with the government, but then the Supreme Court got involved. The Supreme Court was requested for review of this case. The family took this to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court granted review and ultimately disagreed with the lower court's ruling. In their 9-0 unanimous ruling, the Supreme Court made something very clear. They claimed that you don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. Because of this, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to apply the correct standard. Now, recently, the 11th Circuit, after remand of this case, reheard arguments following that Supreme Court ruling. And one theme repeatedly emerged during those oral arguments. They were addressing where is the line between protected policy decisions and ordinary negligence by the law enforcement officers. Throughout the hearing, the judges repeatedly pressed the government to explain how executing a warrant at the wrong house could possibly qualify as protected policy judgments. The panel appeared very concerned that under the government's current theory in this case, nearly any mistake made during a law enforcement operation could potentially be shielded from immunity as some sort of policy discretion or some sort of just policy decision. Several judges on that panel also pushed the government to explain how its current position was consistent with the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling that they just issued in this case. The 11th Circuit is now also reviewing this case after those arguments. There was questions about whether they were going to request additional briefs. They have not done that, and so now they are set to issue their ruling. But now also in this case, the Martin family has filed supplemental authorities with the 11th Circuit pointing to a new ruling that came out of the 5th Circuit in a case called Morris versus the United States. And what's interesting is that Morris case out of the 5th Circuit deals with almost the exact same issue that appears currently in this Martin case. The question is whether government employees receive immunity when they negligently carry out an operation after making a discretionary decision. Now, that distinction is incredibly important for this case because nobody disputes that law enforcement officers make discretionary decisions and those type of judgment calls. The question is, what happens when they execute those decisions improperly or potentially negligently? According to the Martin family in their filing, the 5th Circuit in that ruling recognized that there is a major difference between a policy decision and the execution of that decision. The 5th Circuit explained that even if government officials make a discretionary choice, they do not automatically receive immunity for every mistake that occurs afterwards. So in other words, choosing a course of action may involve discretion, but botching the execution of that choice is something entirely different. And that's exactly where the Martin's case currently lives. Now, importantly, the government here is not simply conceding that 5th Circuit Morris decision actually helps the Martin family in their case. In fact, the DOJ is already arguing that the Morris case is completely different. According to the government in their new filing, in their response, they argue that Morris involved negligent execution after a policy decision had already been actually made. The government argues that the Martin case here is different because the decision being challenged are intertwined with law enforcement planning and operational judgments, and that has been tied and kind of intertwined from the very beginning. So in other words, the DOJ is still trying to frame what happened as part of a protected discretionary law enforcement operation and not something that can be separated from, the initial decision and then the operation after the fact. The government essentially says that the court cannot isolate individual mistakes from broader law enforcement decisions surrounding that type of raid. And they argue if courts start to second guess those type of decisions, well, then the DOJ says that it risks, turning nearly every law enforcement operation into potential civil liability. And the government and the FBI say that is a major concern to them because if the plaintiff here can simply point to a mistake that occurred during an operation and separate it from the broader decision-making process, well, then the discretionary function exception in their eyes becomes significantly weaker and maybe can never be used. So the DOJ is urging the 11th Circuit to not read Morris as broadly as the Martin family wants, and they argue that 5th Circuit ruling should just simply be disregarded and just not used to reach the final ruling by the 11th Circuit. Now, it's important to remember that the Morris case is a 5th Circuit ruling, and it's not coming out of the 11th Circuit, and so it's not currently binding on the 11th Circuit. And, they do not have to use that to actually reach their ruling in this Martin case. But it is persuasive authority that the Martins are pointing to as some sort of basis to say the 5th Circuit ruled and looked at a similar case and they ruled this way, and therefore you should do the same here in the 11th Circuit. So that's what's currently going on in this critical case, the Martin versus the United States case that already had a 9-0 unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court. And I have no doubt, depending on what the 11th Circuit rules, this may eventually also find its way back in front of the Supreme Court. So as we get more information as it develops, I will let you guys know. If you want to ensure that you continue to get updates on this video, on this topic, and other topics as well, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and also make sure you turn on the notification icon to ensure that you never miss these videos. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.